Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Mold Pros webinar series. Today we have Dr. Delia from Prisim Analytics, and today she'll be talking about how VOCs affect your home and how they can be tested for. So I know this is a lot different than anything that we've been talking about in the past. We've been talking about how to look at a good home, how to treat these type of things with different types of treatments, but this is the first time we've been talking about the analytical side of VOC testing. So I'm really happy to have Dr. Delia here to help us with this and to give us some insight into it. So thank you very much, Dr. Delia, and I'm really looking forward to listening to this talk.
Thanks, Matt. I'm really happy to be here as well. It's my favorite subject, so it's always a fun thing for me to talk to everybody else about all the things that VOCs are and have an effect. It's a lot that people don't necessarily think about a lot, but it can have a profound effect on basically every aspect of indoor environments, health, odors, general comfort kinds of things. So we'll get going here. Let me make sure I can actually advance this. There we go. So everybody pretty much is confused about what to do with VOCs. They're hard to detect, they're hard to describe, you can't see them, oftentimes you can't smell them, you don't feel anything. It's really easy to not even think that there might be a problem having to do with VOCs. But especially with so many other things. People talk about particulate, and you can get onto things with carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide or radon or things like that. But because VOCs can be so complicated, there's a lot of them. There's really no one way to measure everything, and the effects can be widely variable. So it's a bit of a puzzle to put together to try to put that with all the other things in the indoor environment, as well as the occupants of that space, what kind of situation they might be in, what kind of sensitivities they might have, prior experiences with other kinds of toxins or exposures that might have also been affecting them. So we're going to go through a bit of what are VOCs. I know you guys all know a little bit about that at least, but maybe a bit more into how to characterize them or how to view them in that way. Also going to look at some of the health aspects. Can't do a lot in terms of, really an in-depth view, just because it does get so complicated in terms of, as I said, what affects what and what interacts with what and all those kinds of things. And then wrapping that up with a little bit of a, what do we do now? So this is more on the aspect of what, you're more familiar with would be, okay, I've got this client, they have this problem, how am I going to try to fix it? So we'll go into that in just a bit of detail. So VOC problems, there are a lot of VOC problems, but here's just a handful of them that we see pretty frequently. Certainly any kind of recent construction or renovation. Obviously you're bringing in a lot of new materials. They're also fresh. So, paint or even adhesives or other kinds of things that might have been used in that renovation process are always going to be more when they're new than after some period of time. Building design and construction, that's more and more building science is getting to be one of those areas that people are really starting to pay attention to. So not just looking at, energy efficiency or air exchange or any of those kinds of things, but what materials are you using to make that? Are those what are termed low VOC types of materials, or what is their durability or sustainability or those kinds of things? Obviously any kind of problems with the structure, all very, very familiar with water intrusion leading to mold problems, but there can certainly be others with ventilation, as well as, like I said, the general durability of the products themselves. And then, of course, you get into the occupants. So once you bring people into a building, things can change radically. So they bring their own stuff in, furniture and carpet and drapes and all those kinds of things. The activities that they have, what do they like to do? Do they have hobbies that might affect things? My father really likes to do woodworking. He has a wood shop in the basement. But if he's going to be doing any kind of staining or those kinds of things, he brings it upstairs because he knows it's going to just sit there and it's not going to go anywhere. So, and then of course we have stored things. So we all like to keep things just in case we're going to need them for something else. You never know. Got that little, a quarter of the paint can left, and maybe you'll use it to touch something up or whatever. But after 10, 15, 20 years go by, it's really necessary to keep all that stuff, because anything you have has the potential to emit VOCs, even if it appears to be sealed. So that's one of those things that is a little bit of a balancing act of what do you need and to keep, and then how do you keep that stuff safe. So VOCs. So what are they? At its easiest, they're a gas at room temperature. Now, not all gases are VOCs, but gases, that are going to have basically carbon and hydrogen in them, which is the organic part of a volatile organic compound. That's basically what a VOC is. It's something that's going to be a gas at room temperature that has carbon in it. So these gases, these molecules are extremely small. So this is just a little bit of an image, just showing how they bounce around, move everywhere. So this is one of the things that makes VOCs difficult, especially in comparison to something like particulate spores, those kinds of things. Because they're so incredibly small, they will actually go through just about any material. So you've got your wall, ceiling, carpet, those kinds of things. You've got, whatever's in the dresser, or some other kind of storage container. You got a pile of boxes in the corner with whatever, because since you just moved, all those things, the VOCs will go through all of those. So that means that source apportionment is going to be a complicated process if there's not something really obvious right there. So invisible, right? These are incredibly large compared to what I would call actual VOCs, but they do have a range of sizes within that category. They also have a number of different groups which have different properties, and come from different things. So the kinds of chemical compounds you would get from something like gasoline has several groups associated with it, is going to be quite different than something you would get from, for example, paint. So those kinds of groupings are one way to identify what the sources might be. Interactions are another one. So some things are really stable in the sense that they just kind of sit there. Other things are much more reactive. So if those are available or around or being released by anything, you can have kind of a carryover effect where something you didn't have before now exists because of something that was there. So basically you have compound A plus compound B gives you compound C. But you don't know where C came from because there isn't any individual source for it. So that's another part that makes finding those sources quite challenging. And of course, the effects. So odor is certainly one. I'm not going to talk that much about odor here today, but there's a wide range of effects that have to do with odor. So one of those is the threshold. So how low of a concentration do you have to have in order to be able to detect it? What's the character of it? Does it smell sweet? Is it fruity? Is it acrid? Is it pungent? So the character that it has. And then what are the ranges of those thresholds? So some people are really sensitive and they'll smell things at really, really low levels, kind of the canary in the coal mine type people. Others, you could dump it on their heads and they wouldn't even notice. They just are essentially nose blind. So there you get into a difficulty with defining what the problem is if you've got an odor problem, because it's likely that anybody who goes into that space could very conceivably describe it in a different way. So back to sizes. So this is basically volatility, right? So there's volatile organic compounds. It's also very volatile and semi-volatile. And this has to do approximately with size. Here we're actually looking at temperature. So one of the common ways of describing these has to do with the boiling point. Now that is the point where essentially the compound goes from a liquid or a solid into a gas phase. And this is not like a one and done thing. So if you've got something that's going to go into the gas phase at 250 degrees Fahrenheit, then you're going to have, I mean, it's not that when it gets to that point, it's just going. It's going to be from 200 to 300, with the majority of it coming from 250 to 300 kind of a thing. So the very volatile compounds, those are going to be what are typically what we think of as permanent gases. In other words, they're always in the gas state. So methane, for example, would be one of those. Very rarely are you going to have that in any kind of a liquid or a solid state, unless you've basically forced it to do that because of pressure or temperature or something like that. The volatiles, those are, as I said, kind of in the middle. So that's going to basically be the stuff that we're mostly going to be aware of in terms of smell, irritation, those kinds of physical symptoms or effects. Although we can obviously generate longer term effects as well. And then the semi-volatile, those are the ones that are going to be partially in the gas state, but depending on the conditions, they're going to be more in the liquid or solid. So those are the kinds of things that, as you increase in temperature, you are also going to find more of them basically condensing out of the air. So those are going to essentially fall onto surfaces or into dust or things like that. So if you have a concern about some of these semi-volatiles, one of the common ways of collecting a sample is to actually collect a dust sample. So you get a little vacuum or something like that, and you collect an amount of the dust, and then that goes off to a lab, and they extract it and run it through an instrument, and then they can tell you about the pesticides that might have been present, or flame retardants, or any kind of thing that's going to be of a concern for the semi-volatiles. Some of these semi-volatiles do tend to have a higher level in terms of a health effect, but you aren't typically going to smell them. So you're not going to notice them at all. It's not going to be apparent that that they're there, unless you have a source that you know of that you are then going to say, aha, I have this, therefore I should look for some of these semi-volatiles. And then beyond that, you basically get solid, right? So these are going to be what are termed non-volatile. In other words, they're basically never going to get into the air unless you have a very extreme type of conditions. And then that moves up into basically particles. So up there at the top, you see particle-bound organic matter. So that means it's not going to be a particle itself, but it could be attached to a particle. So again, looking at dust or other particulate, which you can collect from the air as well. But you're looking at something that's going to be attached to something else. Just as a brief example, formaldehyde we think of formaldehyde as a VOC, but it's actually very volatile. So its boiling point is minus 19 Celsius. So that's below the freezing point of water. So this is another one that is going to be pretty much always in the gas phase. We get a lot of complaints about formaldehyde. I'm sure you've come across your share of those as well. And this is one of the reasons formaldehyde is so omnipresent, is because it is going to be in the gas phase. You're not going to have a layer of formaldehyde on something. We'll go look at off-gassing a little bit later, but essentially any of these compounds can be emitted from something else. So that's where we get most of these. They're being emitted from something. So formaldehyde is one that can get into the air very, very readily. And if you've got a lot of different sources of it, you could get quite a high concentration quite quickly. So that's one of those things that we're always concerned about, is things like that that we know have a possibly quite significant health concern. So looking on up the size range, so this is really nice. I really like this actually, looking at the various size ranges of the things we commonly see in an indoor environment or an outdoor environment. So, you know, you get your pollen, mold spores, excuse me. So these are in microns. So PM 2.5, PM10. PM10 is getting into the point of dust that you might actually be able to see. PM 2.5, one of the reasons people are much more concerned about that is basically due to the shape of the way that our breathing system works, right? There's that sharp right angle at the back of your throat down into your lungs. So basically the larger particulate is going to not be able to make that turn. So it's basically going to hit the back of your throat and you'll sneeze or cough it up or whatever. But if it's 2.5 microns or lower, it can usually make its way down into your lungs. And that's where we have the big concern about damage to lungs from particulates. And we can see down here, way on the left, those are the gaseous contaminants. So these are going to be the VOCs. And you can see here that they're very much smaller than just about everything else. There's a few viruses that are in there. You might get a tiny little bit of dust, but basically everything else is at least 10 times larger than the VOCs themselves. And most of them are about 1,000 or more times larger. So this also makes it complicated to collect them, because you can't use the same mechanisms or equipment that you use to collect something like mold spores, because they'll just whistle right through. They're far too small to be captured by something that you're looking at for mold spores or allergens or something like that. All right, let's take a look at some of the effects. So this is looking mostly at environmental conditions here. A lot of things affect VOCs because they move around so much, because they're very dependent on temperature and other types of parameters that you'd find in an indoor environment. So temperature is probably the biggest one. So the higher the temperature, the more VOCs you get. The lower the temperature, the fewer VOCs. This is something we've come across in both, I guess, I'll call them positive and negative, but we have had samples that have come into us where the temperature inside the building, usually it's a home in that case, is something like 65 degrees Fahrenheit. But the normal temperature, if it was occupied or it kind of in its normal way, it's going to be something more like 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 75. So you can actually have, as you know, 2 times, I don't know, it's a variable depending on what type of VOCs you're looking at, but you might have a 2 times increase in the VOCs going from something like 60 to 75. So if you have a building where the heat's been off, or it's been vacant for a long time and nobody's really messed around with it, you have to be thoughtful about the possible effect that you might have. And then obviously on the other side, if it's really hot and nobody's turned the air conditioning on and it's 85, but it's normally going to be 70, kind of same deal, right? It might look really, really bad, but it might not be quite that bad once it gets back into that more regular or normal, typical operating conditions. Humidity is another one, not quite as big of a factor as temperature. And again, quite variable depending on what type of VOC you're looking at. That's where those different groups come in. But in general, as the humidity goes up, you are also going to have more VOCs. They basically are more essentially soluble in the air because of the higher moisture content. And then on an opposite side, you have ventilation, right? So the more ventilation you have, the lower the VOCs are going to be, or the fewer the VOCs are going to be. And the less you have, the higher or more VOCs you're going to have. This is everybody knows this, but I know most people, certainly in homes anyway, if they're not actively heating or air conditioning the home, there's not even a fan on. So you basically have only just the movement of the gases as they gradually move around, or as somebody moves through that space and swirls them around themselves or brings in something from outside. You have a real big problem with determining what that ventilation is, if there is even a ventilation rate, and what you might do to, or whether something as simple as having a fan only setting on the HVAC system that runs all the time, might actually have a really, really significant effect, because it's rare that it's on all the time. So in general, you're going to get an increase with temperature and humidity, and a decrease with ventilation. Get that slightly confusing on that one, but said temperature, humidity, you're going to have higher VOCs at higher levels. Ventilation, you're going to have lower VOCs at higher levels. All right, so let's take a look at what kind of effects we might see with that. So total VOCs. This is a really common way of looking at indoor air in terms of a general, how bad is it kind of thing. So there's a couple different ways of doing it, but basically you're looking at the aggregate of the VOCs that are in that air. This can be misleading because it matters what makes up those VOCs, which you can't always tell with, just a total VOC doesn't tell you anything about that. You'd have to do some additional processing or analysis to get an idea as to which compounds are in there. So you could have a really low VOC, but it could contain several things that are of high concern. So initially it might look like things were fine or would have very little effect from the VOCs, but that's not the case. And vice versa, you can have quite high VOCs that aren't individually of concern, because there's the aggregate of a bunch of little amounts here and there, or little sources. We see this a lot in some of the tighter homes that have not been kind of retrofitted to accommodate the appropriate ventilation or air filtration, where there's not like a lot of any one thing per se. It's just it's built up to the point that it's now a problem. So there's not like a lot of paint from they just painted, or that it's almost like an even mix of a bunch of different things. So there also isn't necessarily consensus on what is an acceptable level of total VOCs. So marked on here, 500 nanograms per liter. So this is what most of the green building programs take as their acceptable VOC level. A few of them have used 300. However, most places, their VOCs are in the 1,000 to 2,000 range. Just with building and occupant and all those other parameters, that's kind of where most of them end up. Anything under 1,000 is actually pretty good. Even green building certifications or sampling for green buildings, they often can't meet that 500 nanograms per liter mark. So they are or can be often higher than that. I mean, you have a new building and all those, new materials and all the rest of that. It does not take much to build up those VOC levels. So what does make up those VOC levels? So here's just a list of stuff. This is not by any means comprehensive. There's a lot more stuff that is going to be involved, but these are things that pretty much you can find always, right? You're always going to find again, looking more at residences than commercial buildings, laundry supplies. In commercial buildings, you also have, whatever the janitorial cart has on it, so cleaning materials and all those things that are used to maintain a commercial building as well. But furniture, anything in that space. Maintenance is one too. If things haven't been maintained, if the filters haven't been changed in a year, those kinds of things are going to contribute as well. And some things we don't even think about, like dry cleaning. So if you've got somebody who in their job has a lot of dry cleaning, it comes in those little plastic bags. So if you leave them in those and put them in your closet, that's actually a really significant source of the tetrachloroethylene, usually PCE, it's called in the shorthand, which has some pretty significant potential health effects. And it gets more important. Those things get more important too when you think about where they are. So anything that is near your head, basically in your breathing zone, is going to have a more significant, in other words, you're going to inhale more of it because it is right there than something all the way across the room. So this is one of the reasons laundry supplies get a good look. A lot of those have scents in them, other kinds of things. And that clothing that you then, after it's been laundered, is going to be right there in your breathing zone. Same kind of thing with, sheets and pillows and blankets and those kinds of things as well. So splitting up these sources a little bit, there's two basic types, right? There's building sources and there's occupant sources. There are some sources from outside as well, but those typically are pretty minor compared to the building sources. So obviously that's going to be something that's part of the building. It's not going to come in and out as people move in and out or anything like that. It's going to be specifically part of the building. We already talked a little bit about how you get a lot more VOCs in a recent construction or renovation type situation. Because there's a lot of these building materials, you do run into the difficulty of the off-gassing process lasting for a long time, years. If you think about paint, an office that's 10 by 10, you think about the surface area of those walls, that's a lot of surface area to be emitting those paint VOCs. So you can get those for a really long time. And especially as the newer or the more new things you have, the higher that level is going to be. And there's a lot. I mean, there's the substructure, there's the insulation, there's the finished interior. All those kinds of things are going to have an impact on that. And of course, whatever you've got in there that's part of the building in terms of the HVAC system. If it's oversized, undersized, not maintained properly, any of those kinds of things. If you have appliances that are there, is it a gas stove or something like that? If you have a leak, there might be a leak. You might have a carbon monoxide problem, those kinds of things. Although those are hopefully not a chronic problem. And then you've got the occupant sources, which is basically anything. I mean, anything that the occupants bring in or do inside that structure is going to be an occupant source. So that would be now looking more at the furniture, carpet, draperies, toys, activities, cooking, cleaning, any of those kinds of things are going to be considered occupant sources. So these tend to be not quite so long lasting in that sense, but they can still be pretty significant. And they're more variable too. The building sources, other than changes in, temperature and things over the course of seasons, the building sources aren't going to really change a lot. They're going to remain fairly steady. But once you add the occupant sources on top of the building sources, then now you've got a great deal of potential variability. All right, so switching gears, we're going to take a look at some of the health aspects and what it is that we're looking at and why we're concerned about some of those. So it's basically the indoor environment, right? I mean, anything in the indoor environment is going to have an impact on mentioned odors before, but health as well. And it may be something that nobody knows about. It's, hey, I've always had a stuffy nose. That's just the way it is. It's the pollen outside or something like that. But then you go to a different place and all of a sudden, wait, I don't have that anymore. I thought my allergies always kicked in, but I don't have allergies here. So that is one of those things that people tend not to think about in general, the aggregate, again, of all of the aspects of the indoor environment. So one of the biggest ones is obviously the fact that we spend most of our time indoors. 5 to 10% maybe outdoors. The last year or so has been extra weird, where we had even more time at home and in unfamiliar places or in unfamiliar ways. Seen a number of things come through that is somebody who now has a home office in the basement or the side room or whatever, and just hasn't been feeling well for months. Well, that's really the only change, right? They're now doing their work at home. So something about either the way they've set up their home office, or maybe there was always a problem, but they spent relatively little of their time, or half of their time, only half of their time in the home, as opposed to basically all of it. And so now the increased exposure is now causing additional problems. And that also affects, obviously, productivity and, general comfort, and affects things like anxiety and all that as well. So you've got multiple areas of effect in those particular situations. So design, it's in this sense, older homes is probably getting on to something like 20 years. But certainly the tightness of buildings has vastly increased, and the whole sick building syndrome thing, that is still an issue, even though we've known about it now for quite some time. It's, obviously it's not necessarily that the building is sick, it's that, again, you got the buildup of whatever VOCs are in there, maintenance problems, those kinds of things. But regardless, if you have an older or a leaky building, a lot of those VOCs and other things are going to escape. They're basically just going to go out the little gaps here and there. So even though you might have exactly the same things going on in those two buildings, the one that's tighter is always going to have a higher level, just because those chemical compounds have no place to go. So that's where you now get into filters and other types of systems that are designed to either filter out or break down VOCs and other indoor contaminants. And you also have a lot of different materials. So a lot of plastic and rubber and things like that, nylon carpets, all those kinds of things. So these are synthetic materials that we don't necessarily have as good feel for how those are going to affect things long-term, especially. They just, even though these things have been around for a really long time, they have not been around long enough for us to get as much information as we had about the effect of some of the more natural ingredients or components. Not that those aren't a problem too. If you think about the framing in something like a home, you got a lot of wood, so you got a lot of formaldehyde, a lot of it's pine, so you're going to get some of those terpenes like alpha pinene are going to be pretty high. So you still have, even if it's a man-made, or excuse me, a natural material, you're still going to have a goodly amount of VOCs, but the type of VOCs you're going to have, or the groups of VOCs, are typically not going to have the type of unknown hazards that some of the synthetic materials will. Oftentimes those are because they're meant to be durable, right? They're meant to last for a really long time. If they're going to last for a really long time, then that means they can't break down. They have to wear well. They have to maintain their structural integrity, or whatever the purpose of those was. So that right there means you've got a more persistent set of chemical compounds that you're dealing with. And there are a lot of different kinds. These are just a handful that I found this nice little picture of. But there's a lot of different things in a lot of different places that are going to have synthetic materials that we just don't know yet. So what effects are we going to get from VOCs? So we do have obviously short and long-term effects. The short-term effects tend to be more irritation. You know, your eyes are teary a little bit, or, you know, you just got that little sniffle you can't get rid of, or something like that, or you're itchy, you're getting a rash or something like that. But those typically are going to go away when you're not in that environment. The longer term effects are also going to take longer to develop. So, you know, if you start to have some sort of a respiratory problem, you know, you may have had to be in that environment for 5 years before anything really started to show, because that process is going to be slower because it has to work its way all the way through the body. And then it has to mostly build up. That is one of the reasons we have some of these long-term effects, is because of the buildup that we have over time. Not always. I mean, some of them have to do with what it is. And is that going to cause, you know, a central nervous system problem? So now you got a little tick, or, you know, something like that. Again, there's a lot of different VOCs, have a lot of different effects, and different people have different sensitivities. So that always makes it a lot more challenging. So one of the terms that's used to describe this is the toxic body burden, right? So basically, kind of like this nice little bucket, your body has a ways to process all the various things that you come in contact with. And it's really good at that. But at some point, the bucket gets full. In other words, it's got a finite capacity. It doesn't necessarily matter what it is, your body still has to process it. So this is where we get into some of the misconceptions about what it is that we're dealing with that is going to be toxic to us. So, right, what are toxins? It's an extremely generic word. There is no real definition of what exactly that is. So basically, everything is a toxin, whether it's something that you like, something you don't like, something you need, something you don't need. Everything has to be processed. So therefore, from that particular perspective, toxins, everything is a toxin. So one of the things we always try to do is minimize those, right? So that we don't overflow the bucket. So scented products, air fresheners. I really dislike air fresheners in general. For the most part, they're masking something else. But that is, again, more things that your body has to process. So you're just adding essentially overload onto whatever problem you had to start with, which may make that problem worse, right? So now, rather than an irritation type of a situation, now you're essentially perpetually sick, because not only did you have whatever the initial problem is, but now you've added so many other things that it's just exacerbated the whole process. Now, some of these toxins are what we would normally think of as toxins. I mentioned formaldehyde earlier. There's some of those kinds of things. There's gasoline fuels. A lot of paints can potentially have that effect. And then you also have the activities, right? So if you're cooking, that's generating a lot right there. Cleaning, same deal. Gotten a little obsessive about cleaning in the last year, but that can actually contribute and make things worse. It comes back again to how do you balance it, right? If you are cooking, do you have the range hood on? Is the range hood working? Is it going outside the building, or is it filtering and then recycling the air in? Was again looking at are all the components working properly? Switching gears a little bit, we're talking about where all these VOCs come from, right? So basically everything is going to off-gas VOCs. So off-gassing is a kind of a complex process, right? So, and it's reversible, actually. It goes both ways. But if we look here at this extremely simple diagram, So we've got whatever this is, let's call it a table, right? So you've got the material inside of that. You've got the surface coating, and then you've got the air around it, right? So it's basically a migration process, right? So you have it going from, let's say, inside the material, right? It goes out to the surface and then out to the air. If it gets reversed, then you have it going from the air to the surface and inside the material. Now, the movement inside the material is going to be a lot slower than the movement in the air. So this is one of the reasons you get things that off gas for a really long time, because that process is just slow. So as the air sweeps by it, it'll move those chemical compounds somewhere else. So then you get more of that material, or the more of those compounds coming from the material to the surface and back out. So you can kind of think about it a little bit like this, right? So as things migrate towards that surface, they come out of that surface, they kind of hang there, you know, something comes along that moves them out of the way, and then it keeps going. You can think of it as an equilibrium process, right? So if you've got, if it's unbalanced in some way, it's going to try to balance itself. So if you've got nothing in the air and everything in the material, it's going to go from that higher concentration in the material to the lower concentration in the air. And again, vice versa. So that was what you get in something more like a fire, right? You've got a large concentration, it's very hot. The material doesn't have any of that in it. So it's gonna absorb into the material quite quickly. Once the fire's out and clean up and all the rest of that, you now have a lot in that material, call it a table again. And that's going to be slowly being emitted back into the air. So one of the reasons you get that characteristic smoky smell a year or two later is because, for whatever reason, usually heat, in other words, it's gotten hot, that equilibrium has shifted and now you've got more coming out into the air. But this is essentially the process that goes on all the time, all around us. And the more porous something is, typically the more interactive this process is. So, you know, you got, you know, bedding, and you've got a, you know, shaggy carpet, and, you know, those kinds of things. You're going to have more of that interaction than you are with the table we talked about, or drywall, or something like that. Some of these harder materials aren't going to be as active in that off-gas process. Not that they aren't off-gassing, but it's going to be a slower process. So what do we do with this? How do we look at it? So we have to essentially assess the chemical exposure, right? So how do you do that? So this is bypassing all the part about collecting a sample, having it analyzed, looking at that data, trying to connect that data back into where, you know, the source, where did those chemical compounds come from? So we're basically skipping past all of that to what do I need to be worried about from a strictly health perspective. So there's almost no way to know without having something to compare it with, right? You know, I've got compound A and compound B. There's the same amount of them. Compound A is a carcinogen and compound B is basically nothing. So we still need to know for compound A, how do we know that? What level are we going to say is going to be something that we're going to be concerned about? So all familiar, I think, with workplace exposure limits. So that would be OSHA and to some extent NIOSH. That's going to be rare outside of a industrial or manufacturing facility. Even a commercial non-industrial or manufacturing facility is typically not going to be anywhere near an OSHA level. So at that point, you're not looking at that, you know, that kind of a comparison value. It's too high. It won't be useful for this. So here's where we get into some sort of a toxicological study. So that's where they spend several years and feed whatever it is to rats and mice and whatever creatures like that. And they gather all the data as to, you know, what the effect was, what organs did it affect, you know, how much was required in order to produce that effect. And then from that, they basically do a kind of a conversion into how that might affect a human. So not exactly the most direct way of doing it, but obviously you don't want to feed a human a million times more than might be expected to hurt them. And then along with that comes a bunch of statistics. So that's most of these values that we get that are considered residential are going to be some combination of those. And different of these comparison values are going to use different studies and different assumptions and all that kind of stuff. So here's just a list kind of several of these for benzene. So over on the far right, we have the workplace. So that's going to be OSHA, NIOSH. ACGIH is also going to be a workplace. Those are listed in parts per million. You see some of these here. The next one over, the ATSDR, minimal risk level, that's parts per billion. So there's 1,000 parts per billion in a part per million. So that means the OSHA is 1,000 parts per billion, the NIOSH is 100, and the ACGIH is 500 parts per billion. So those are, with the exception of the acute of the California, those are much, much higher than you're going to expect to see. So, but we go all the way in this case from, what do we have, 0.36 on one side to 1,000 parts per million, or 1,300 nanograms per liter, or micrograms per meter cube. So the same units. And these all have different assumptions and different backgrounds. You see here, there's, chronic, intermediate, and acute, or chronic 8-hour and acute. So those are the assumptions of, okay, so chronic would basically be lifetime, right? Over the course of some number of years, you really don't want to get above that level. If you got the occasional larger exposure, as long as it's not too large, there's an assumption that that will also not be particularly difficult to deal with or harmful in that sense. But, then you get into, something that's less than 1, it's kind of hard to tell. Benzene, we usually see, I don't know, 2 to 6 nanograms per liter or micrograms per meter cubed. So, again, how do we want to assess that? Unfortunately, it's really hard to tell which of these you might want to use in which situation. I try to find kind of a middle ground. I've noticed that the EPA regional screening level values tend to be really, really low. But again, the purpose of those is more to look at something like a Superfund site and see at what point do they need to put some additional effort into, finding or mitigating that particular chemical compound. So the California is a little bit on the low side, at least not in this case, but in a lot of cases. ATSDR kind of tends to be kind of medium-ish, I suppose you could call it. But anyway, these are what we have to deal with in order to say, should we be concerned? Should we not? If we are concerned, what is the next step? What is it that we're going to do? So this is just giving you a little bit of where these values I just showed came from. These are by no means the only values to look at. These are all also US values. There are European, Canadian, World Health Organization has a few. Many states also have their own recommendations for residential or commercial, but not industrial types of work environments. So again, you're looking at, hey, if my state has these nice values, then great, I will stick with the state values. And those are the ones that I'll cite. If somebody disagrees, they can cite a different one of these particular values, these recommendations. All right, so switching gears again, I know we're running out of time, but I'm almost done, I promise. Gets to the now what situation. So typically we're looking at, what do we do, right? We remove what we can, we contain what we can't, and we dilute the rest, right? So anything you don't actually need, at a minimum, if you need it, can you put it further away from the building in a shed or something like that? Some of these things, as I said, they're sitting around forever, and you obviously haven't needed them in the last 10 years. Do you really need to keep them? Containing, so putting cleaning supplies in a tight plastic bin. Do you have, as mentioned, a separate storage area? Are there surfaces that you think might be worth sealing, which would minimize the emissions from those surfaces? And then dilution, right? That's that little old saw, right? The solution to pollution is dilution. It is still true, but it's kind of the hardest, can be one of the hardest to maintain. better off removing it if you can, or minimizing it. And then you're looking at, the ventilation rates. You have an air filtration or purification system, any of those things that you can use to minimize any of those emissions or exposures. And this is just a little bit of a guide of, hey, at what point do I want to look for something else? So I'm not gonna go through all these, but problems that weren't there before. So when did the problem start? What changed right before that problem started? Are you getting something that's historical? You have got previous occupants in a space, or you've got neighbors. We've had a lot of those where we get something either in a multi-unit residential or a little strip mall or something like that, and you get lots of complaints because the air is coming from somewhere else and is invading that space. And that's what I have. So I'd be happy for any questions that anybody has.
That was a great talk. Thank you very much. I mean, it seemed like to me our need to conserve energy in the home, like making homes more energy conservative, of triple pane glass, more insulation, making it more airtight so that heat or air conditioning doesn't leave, seems to be kind of counteracting our need to get air throughout the building. Would that be correct?
It is. That's where a lot more thought needs to go into how to mitigate, or how to balance those, I should say, right? We still want to keep the energy efficiency and the properly built buildings and all that. But then, and one of the traditional ways, obviously, of getting more ventilation is to pull in outside air, which is great if you live in an area that has good outside air. If I'm in the middle of LA on one of those horrible air quality days, I don't want to pull in the outside air. Or if I'm in Beijing or someplace that has basically an outdoor air quality problem on a longer term basis. So then what do you do? If you're just overturning the air, if you're not bringing in outdoor air, then you have to look at other technologies. Are you filtering it? Are you breaking it down in some way? What are you doing to reduce the chemical compounds or the chemical amounts in the air?
Do you have any suggestions on different types of technologies that people should be using for those types of processes?
There's a lot of different types, so it really does depend on a lot more on the individual situation. Is this a short-term thing, long-term thing? You have other things you're worried about. If you're worried about pollen and dust and things like that, then you want to have something that handles particulate as well as chemical. If you're worried about viruses and bacteria, then you also have something that can handle the biological side. So a lot of that depends. There's a lot of different technologies out there, going back to just the VOCs, and most of them are quite effective. Some of them may have other side effects that you aren't happy with. So, and some of them are, it's just an expense. Yeah. Or it's a maintenance thing. Hey, if I have to change this filter every 3 weeks, I'm not buying it. So there are those kinds of things as well that might make those decisions.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your time. I think this is I definitely would like listening to it. It was a great talk. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to email her at adelia@patty-air.com. And we'll be seeing everybody next time. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much.